I didn't realize how loud silence could be until the moment my ex-wife laughed and everyone else followed her lead. It happened in the middle of a crowded room, under soft yellow lights with paper plates balanced on knees, and someone's phone recording from the corner. She tilted her head, smiled the way she always did when she thought she was being clever, and said, "Without me, you're nothing." People chuckled. Someone coughed. I said nothing. 2 weeks later, I invited her over for tea, and when she stepped through the front gate of my house, her hands started shaking so badly she almost dropped her phone. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 52 years old, and 6 months ago, my ex-wife publicly decided to remind everyone who she believed I was. It was my daughter Ava's college graduation party, held in the backyard of Vanessa's house, the house she kept after the divorce. There were about 30 people there, family, friends, a few of Ava's classmates. String lights hung between the fence and the pergola, and someone had set up a Bluetooth speaker playing soft pop music that faded into background noise once conversations took over. I arrived early like I always do, old habit. I brought a simple gift for Ava and a bottle of sparkling water for myself. I'd learned over the years that staying clear-headed around Vanessa was a form of self-defense. At first, everything was fine. Polite smiles, light conversation. Vanessa played the gracious host, floating from group to group with practiced ease. She laughed loudly, touched people's arms when she spoke, made sure everyone knew how proud she was of Ava and how much she'd sacrificed to get her there. I stood off to the side near the patio, listening more than talking. I didn't mind. I've always been more comfortable observing than performing. The moment came after the toast. Someone, one of Vanessa's cousins, I think, raised a glass and congratulated Ava. Compliments circled the group. Hard work, bright future, so much potential. Then Vanessa took the glass from his hand and cleared her throat. She talked about single motherhood, about doing it all alone, about being both mom and dad. People nodded sympathetically. I noticed Ava glance in my direction once, then look away. And then Vanessa smiled at me. "Well," she said, turning slightly, so the circle opened just enough to include me. "We all know not everyone lands on their feet after a divorce." A few people laughed, uncertain. She continued, "Some people need help, direction. Without it, they just sort of drift." Her eyes stayed on mine. "Without me," she added lightly, "Ethan would be nothing." That's when the room went quiet in a very specific way. The way it does when people aren't sure whether they've just witnessed a joke or something cruel. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes slide toward me, waiting to see how I'd respond. Vanessa wasn't done. She chuckled and said, "I mean, let's be honest. He never could make it on his own. A nice guy, sure, but a failure when it came to real life. Failure." The words sat between us like a drop plate that no one moved to pick up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't look to Ava or anyone else for rescue. I just nodded once, took a slow sip of my water, and let the moment pass. Vanessa mistook my silence for confirmation. Later, as people returned to their conversation, she leaned toward one of her friends and said, loudly enough for me to hear, "See, he knows it's true." I left shortly after that. I hugged Ava, told her I was proud of her, and walked to my car without looking back. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the same one Vanessa liked to describe to people as sad but manageable. It was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the sink. I made myself a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching headlights move along the street below. Vanessa had been telling that story for years. The story where she was the reason anything good ever happened. The story where I was the cautionary tale. After the divorce, I'd let it happen. I took a smaller place, drove an older car, focused on work, paid my bills on time, showed up when Ava needed me. I didn't correct Vanessa when she implied I was struggling. I didn't argue when she told people she was helping me out, even though she never had. Part of me thought silence was the mature choice. Another part of me was just tired. But standing in that backyard, hearing her call me a failure out loud, something shifted. Not anger, clarity. I realized then that confronting Vanessa directly would only give her what she wanted: attention, drama, and another opportunity to control the narrative. She was excellent at that, always had been. If I argued, she'd cry. If I explained, she'd interrupt. If I brought up facts, she'd accuse me of rewriting history. So, I didn't do any of that. Instead, I went home, opened my laptop, and pulled up a spreadsheet I hadn't touched in years. Income, savings, investments, timeline. I didn't label the final column revenge. I labeled it exit. For months, nothing outwardly changed. I went to work. I cooked simple meals. I ignored the occasional text from Vanessa that said things like, "Ava's worried about you," or, "You can ask for help, right?" I stopped correcting her. I stopped reacting at all. And then 2 weeks after the graduation party, I sent her a message. "Hi, Vanessa. I moved recently. I'd like to have you over for tea just to catch up." She replied almost immediately, "That's random. Where are you living now?" I sent her the address. No explanation, no emojis. There was a pause longer than usual. Then, "Sure, Saturday at 2. "Saturday at 2, I replied. The morning she arrived, I woke up early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted the house quiet before it wasn't. I brewed tea and set 2 cups on the kitchen table. I opened the blinds and let the afternoon light spill across the hardwood floors. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees lining the driveway, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. At 2:03 p.m., I heard tires crunch on gravel. I stood by the front door as Vanessa stepped out of her car. She paused at the gate, frowning slightly like someone who knows something is off, but hasn't figured out what yet. She took a step forward, then another, and then she stopped completely. Her eyes traveled from the fence to the front of the house, up toward the windows across the yard. Her mouth opened, then closed. She reached for her phone. Her hands were shaking. And that was when I knew the story she'd been telling about me was about to fall apart. Vanessa stood at the gate longer than anyone reasonably should. Long enough that if someone had been watching from a window, they might have thought she was lost, or reconsidering, or suddenly aware that she'd stepped into a story she no longer controlled. I didn't rush her. I watched through the glass as she lifted her phone, lowered it again, then finally walked up the path with the careful confidence of someone who refuses to look surprised. When I opened the door, she smiled, tight, practiced. "Wow," she said, glancing past me. "This is nice." "Come in," I replied, stepping aside. She crossed the threshold slowly, heels clicking once, then stopping. Her eyes moved the way people's do when they're scanning for clues. Baseboards, corners, ceilings, looking for signs of illusion. Renting, borrowed furniture, temporary staging. There weren't any. The house wasn't extravagant. That was intentional. No marble columns, no grand staircase, just space, light, clean lines, a calm that didn't ask for approval. "This yours?" she asked, voice light, already knowing the answer. "Yes." She laughed softly. "As in, your house sitting?" I didn't respond. Vanessa turned in a slow circle, her hand brushing the kitchen island. She opened a cabinet, closed it, walked to the window, looked out. Her smile never quite came back. I gestured toward the table. Tea? She nodded absently and sat down, still staring around like the walls might contradict me if she looked long enough. As I poured the tea, I felt something unexpected settle over me. Peace. Because this moment, this precise, quiet unraveling, had been years in the making. After the divorce, Vanessa didn't just walk away with the house. She walked away with the story where she'd been the backbone, the provider, the responsible one. And I let her. At the time, it felt easier. We'd split when Ava was 12. She was at that age where stability mattered more than truth. And I didn't want to be the one who rocked her world just to protect my ego. So when Vanessa told people she was helping me get back on my feet, I didn't correct her. When she implied I was barely scraping by, I smiled and changed the subject. When she told Ava, "Your dad's just figuring things out," I nodded and said nothing. Silence, I told myself, was maturity. But silence has a way of being repurposed. Vanessa learned quickly that if I didn't speak, she could speak for me. She told friends I'd struggled with money. She told family I'd never been good with planning. She told Ava I was proud but sensitive and shouldn't be asked about my situation. I became the footnote, the before and after cautionary tale, the man who proved how necessary she'd been. Meanwhile, my actual life looked nothing like the version she'd been circulating. I lived in a modest apartment, yes, but it was paid on time every month. I drove an older sedan because it ran reliably and didn't require a loan. I worked full-time and then some. I saved. I tracked every expense down to the dollar. I wasn't drifting, I was building. But Vanessa never asked. She didn't want to know how I was doing. She wanted to know how I looked and whether she could keep looking better by comparison. There were moments that hurt, like the time Ava hesitated before asking if I'd come to her debate tournament because, as she put it carefully, Mom said, "You might be busy with stuff." Or the afternoon I overheard Vanessa telling her sister on the phone, "He's still renting." It's kind of sad, honestly. I stood in my kitchen that day, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, and wondered how someone could be so comfortable reducing another person's entire existence to square footage. I didn't confront her then, because confrontation gives liars a stage. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed patterns, dates, offhand comments that didn't line up. I remembered things from the divorce that had felt rushed, documents I'd signed because I trusted the process, explanations that had been vague but reassuring. "You don't need to worry about this part," Vanessa had said more than once. "I've already handled it." Handled it how? That question stayed with me, quiet but persistent, like a pebble in a shoe you can't ignore forever. The night after the graduation party, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a yellow legal pad beside it. I didn't write anything dramatic. No accusations, no plans for revenge, just facts. Income, expenses, savings, accounts. I listed what I knew and what I didn't. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I'd avoided for years. What if Vanessa hadn't just talked her way into looking better? What if she'd moved things quietly, deliberately, so the story would always favor her? That thought didn't make me angry. It made me careful. Over the next few weeks, I said even less than usual. I stopped correcting anyone who repeated Vanessa's version of my life. I stopped explaining myself altogether. Instead, I focused on two things: work and proof. Because one day, whether Vanessa intended it or not, The truth would need something solid to stand on. And when that day came, I didn't want noise. I wanted paper. Vanessa lifted her teacup, now hands steadier than they'd been at the gate. She took a sip, eyes still darting around the room. So she said casually, "How long have you been here?" I met her gaze. "Long enough," I said. She smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. And for the first time since our divorce, I realized something important. She wasn't here to catch up. She was here to recalibrate. And that meant the story she'd been telling was no longer safe. Vanessa set her cup down without finishing the tea. I noticed because that had always been her tell. When she was comfortable, she lingered. When she felt cornered, she found reasons not to stay. She glanced at her watch, then at her phone, then back at me with a smile that was trying very hard to look casual. "You didn't answer my question," she said. "How long have you been living here?" "Long enough," I repeated. She laughed lightly as if I were teasing her. "You always do that. You make everything sound mysterious." Then after a beat, "I didn't know you were in a position to buy." There it was, not curiosity assessment. "I worked," I said. "I saved." Vanessa nodded, but I could see her calculating. The same look she used to get when she was deciding how to phrase a story so it landed just right. I didn't give her anything else to work with. A few minutes later, she stood. Well, this was unexpected. She smoothed her jacket, picked up her purse. I should get going. I walked her to the door. She paused once more in the entryway, glanced back at the living room, then at me. "You should tell Ava," she said. "She'll be surprised." "I will," I replied. She hesitated clearly, wanting to say something else, then thought better of it. As soon as she stepped outside, she pulled her phone back out and started typing furiously before she even reached her car. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the quiet settle back into the house. That night, my phone buzzed 3 times. A text from Vanessa, then another, then a missed call. I didn't respond because the truth was, Vanessa wasn't the reason I'd invited her over. She was the preview. The real turning point had happened months earlier on an ordinary Tuesday night that didn't feel important at the time. I'd been sitting at my desk at work, staring at a spreadsheet that refused to balance. It was late. Most of the office lights were off, and the cleaning crew was moving quietly down the hallway. My phone buzzed on the corner of the desk. Marcus Reed. We'd been friends since before my marriage, before Ava, before everything complicated. He worked at a regional credit union, now the kind of place that remembered people instead of just accounts. We didn't talk often, birthdays, the occasional holiday message. But when Marcus called, it was never for small talk. "Hey," he said when I answered. His voice sounded tight. "You got a minute?" "Yeah," I said. "What's up?" A pause. "Then I've been meaning to call you for a long time, Ethan. I just didn't know how." I leaned back in my chair. "Okay, there's something you need to know about the divorce," he said, "about the accounts." The word accounts landed heavier than it should have. "What about them?" Another pause. I could hear him exhale. "I saw some things back then. At the time, I thought you knew or that it wasn't my place." My stomach tightened. "Marcus, when you and Vanessa split," he continued carefully, "there were movements, transfers, decisions that didn't line up with what you signed." I didn't speak. I didn't trust my voice yet. "There was a retirement account," he said. "Not huge at the time, but significant. You were listed as co-contributor." I remembered vaguely. Paperwork meetings. Vanessa insisting she'd handle the financial side because she was better with details. "I remember," I said. Marcus hesitated. "Ethan, The account was liquidated earlier than it should have been, and the beneficiary changes. Those didn't match the final agreement. I sat very still. "What are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying," Marcus replied quietly, "that some money you believe was protected wasn't, and the timing, it coincided with the down payment on Vanessa's house." The room seemed to tilt. "How much?" I asked. Marcus named a number. It wasn't enough to ruin me. That was the cruelest part. It was enough to tilt things, enough to make the years that followed harder than they needed to be, enough to fund a narrative. "I didn't want to believe it at first," Marcus said, "but I pulled the records again last month. Everything lines up. Dates, amounts, authorizations." "Do you have copies?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Statements, transaction histories, email confirmations." I closed my eyes. "Why tell me now?" I asked. "Because Marcus said I heard Vanessa telling someone you'd never have made it without her, and I realized you never actually had a chance to." After we hung up, I stayed in my chair long after the office emptied. I didn't feel angry. I felt clarified. Suddenly, so many things made sense. Why Vanessa had been so confident. Why she'd insisted on managing the paperwork. Why she'd never seemed worried about money afterward. I drove home that night in silence, hands steady on the wheel. When I got inside, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't pour a drink. I opened my laptop. I created a new folder. I labeled it simply Records. Over the next few weeks, Marcus sent everything he had, PDFs of statements, screenshots of archived emails. Each document told the same story from a slightly different angle. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion. It was design. I thought about confronting Vanessa, then calling her, demanding answers. But I knew her too well. She'd cry. She'd deflect. She'd say it was for Ava. She'd accuse Marcus of lying. And by morning, she'd have called everyone we knew to explain how concerned she was about me spiraling. No, I wasn't going to give her that. Instead, I decided to build something she couldn't talk her way around. I doubled down at work, took on projects other people avoided, volunteered for the late meetings, the difficult clients. I lived leaner than before, not because I had to, but because I wanted control. Every month, I watched the numbers move in the right direction. Every month, I reminded myself that silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. By the time I invited Vanessa over for tea, I wasn't trying to impress her. I was positioning the truth. Because when the moment came and I knew it would, the story wouldn't be mine to tell. The paper would do it for me. The hardest part of building something quietly is resisting the urge to explain yourself along the way. After my call with Marcus, I didn't suddenly change my routine. I didn't confront Vanessa. I didn't hint to Ava that something was wrong. Outwardly, my life looked exactly the same as it had for years. Predictable, modest, unremarkable. Inside, everything had shifted. I started arriving at work earlier, not because anyone asked me to, but because I needed the hours when the building was quiet and my thoughts were sharp. I worked in operations for a mid-sized logistics firm. Nothing flashy, nothing that impressed people at dinner parties, but it was complex work, interdependent systems, tight margins, the kind of place where mistakes cost real money and calm decision-making mattered. For a long time, I'd stayed comfortably in the background, reliable, consistent, the man you trusted to keep things running, but didn't spotlight. That changed the night Linda Park called me into her office. Linda was 58, sharp-eyed and allergic to nonsense. She'd been with the company longer than anyone else in leadership and had a reputation for seeing straight through people. She didn't waste words. "I've been watching how you handle pressure," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. You don't panic. You don't posture. You fix things. I opened the folder. It was a project proposal one that had already burned through 2 managers. It's a mess, she continued. Tight timeline, high visibility. If you take it on, you'll make enemies. If you succeed, you'll make a career. I didn't hesitate. I'll take it. From that point on, my days blurred together. 12-hour shifts, sometimes 14. I ate meals at my desk. I learned to shut out distractions completely, including the low hum of resentment I'd carried for years without naming. Vanessa continued telling her version of my life. I knew because people repeated it back to me without realizing it. A mutual acquaintance said once, "It's good you're staying positive given everything." A distant cousin asked, "Are you doing okay financially?" Ava mentioned gently, "Mom says you don't like to talk about work because it stresses you out." I smiled. I reassured. I changed the subject, not because I was hiding, but because I was done performing. Over the next year, things moved steadily. The project landed on time. The client renewed. The numbers improved. Linda sent me a 2-line email one Friday afternoon. "Nice work. Come see me Monday." Monday, she offered me a promotion. Salary bump, new title, more responsibility. I thanked her and went back to my desk. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell my family. I updated my spreadsheet. That became my ritual. Each small victory went into the spreadsheet, not as a boast, but as proof. Numbers didn't care about narratives. They moved whether people believed in them or not. I automated savings, increased my investment contributions, paid down what little debt I had left. I lived on less than I earned, even when I didn't have to anymore. Some nights alone in my apartment, I wondered what would have changed if that retirement account hadn't been touched, if I'd had those years back. That cushion, that head start. Then I reminded myself this wasn't about what I lost. It was about what I was building anyway. By the time my second promotion came, this went into senior management. My salary had crossed into territory Vanessa never imagined I'd reach. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd spent years explaining my limitations, while I quietly outgrew them. Christmas came and went. Vanessa hosted as usual. I attended for Ava's sake. She walked guests through her remodeled kitchen, pointing out upgrades and finishes like a museum docon. At one point, she gestured toward me across the room and said, "Ethan's always been very low maintenance." People smiled politely. I sipped my water and said nothing. Later that night, driving home, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. I was finished. That was when I started looking at houses. Not online at first, but in person. Saturday mornings, coffee in the cup holder, phone on silent. I drove through neighborhoods without urgency, without expectation. I wasn't chasing square footage. I was looking for a feeling. I found it on a quiet street lined with trees, the kind that didn't try to impress. The house wasn't new. It had character, solid bones, light that filled the rooms without effort. Standing in the empty living room during the showing, I felt something settle in my chest. This. I ran the numbers twice, then again. I called my financial advisor, reviewed contingencies, thought about risk, not fearfully, but honestly. Then I made an offer. When it was accepted, I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I went home, opened my spreadsheet, and wrote one line. Ready? Because buying the house wasn't the victory. The victory was knowing I'd reached a place Vanessa could never talk me out of again. And when the time came to show her, I wanted it to be quiet, undeniable. I signed my name 47 times in a small conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and toner. The title agent slid each document across the table with practiced efficiency, tapping the corners into neat alignment before pointing to the next signature line. Deed, disclosure, addendum, initial here, initial there. My hand didn't cramp. It didn't shake. I signed slowly, deliberately, like I was marking time instead of paper. When it was done, she handed me a folder, thin, unremarkable, and a single key on a plain metal ring. "That's it," she said with a professional smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Cole." I thanked her, stood, and walked out into the parking lot alone. The key was warm from her hand. I held it in my palm for a moment before unlocking the car, feeling its weight in a way that had nothing to do with metal. I didn't call Vanessa. I didn't call Ava. I didn't even call Marcus. Some things deserve to exist quietly before the world gets its opinion. I drove straight to the house. The place was empty when I unlocked the front door for the first time. No echoing voices, no footsteps but my own. The light was different inside than it had been during the showing. Warmer now, sliding across the floorboards in long rectangles as the afternoon tipped toward evening. I stood there for a while, just breathing. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about getting even. It wasn't even about the house. Not really. It was about choosing something without asking permission. I moved in slowly, not because I couldn't afford help, but because I wanted to feel every inch of the transition. I packed my car myself, clothes, books, the cast iron skillet I'd had since my 20s, a box of old photographs I'd never quite known what to do with. No moving truck, no audience. The first night, I slept on a mattress on the floor and woke up before sunrise. I made coffee in a bare kitchen and drank it standing by the window, watching the neighborhood come to life. Dog walkers, a jogger, a delivery truck easing down the street. Normal. That mattered more to me than any dramatic reveal ever could. I bought furniture one piece at a time. A solid dining table from an estate sale, a couch deep enough to disappear into. Nothing trendy, nothing fragile, things built to last. As the house filled in, so did my sense of certainty. Vanessa, meanwhile, filled the silence in her own way. She texted, she called. She left messages that swung between curiosity and concern. "Ava says you moved. Why didn't you tell me? Are you sure this is a good idea?" I replied politely, briefly. I didn't offer details. When Ava asked directly, I told her the truth, but not all of it. "I bought a house," I said. "I'm doing well." There was a pause on the line. Mom said, "I know what your mom said," I replied gently. "You don't have to choose sides. Just know I'm okay." She sounded relieved. That was enough for now. The only person I invited over during those first few weeks was Marcus. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon carrying a plain white envelope and a bottle of red wine. He stood in the entryway, took a slow look around, then nodded once. "You did this right," he said. I poured us each a glass and we sat at the kitchen table, the envelope between us like an unspoken agreement. "You ready?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. He didn't push. That's why I trusted him. The envelope stayed in my desk drawer beneath a folder labeled Records and beside the deed, 3 documents that told different versions of the same story. I waited not for courage, for timing. The moment came sooner than I expected. Vanessa called one evening, her voice unusually careful. "Ava mentioned you bought a house," she said. "You know I'd want to see it for her sake." I almost smiled. "Come by Saturday," I said, 2 o'clock. She didn't hesitate. "Sure." I spent the morning cleaning, though the house wasn't dirty. I wiped down counters that hadn't been used, straightened chairs that were already aligned. I needed my hands busy while my mind stayed still. At 1:30, I set the table. 2 cups, 1 teapot, a plate of simple cookies I bought at the bakery down the street. No props, no theatrics, just truth arranged neatly. When I heard the gravel crunch at 20:03, I didn't rush to the door. I waited until Vanessa rang the bell. Standing there, I realized something else. I wasn't nervous because I wasn't asking for anything. I wasn't asking her to understand or apologize or even admit what she'd done. I was giving her a view she couldn't talk her way out of. When she stepped through the gate and froze, I felt no satisfaction, no thrill, just confirmation because the house wasn't the reveal. It was the context. The real story, the one she tried to bury under years of careful narration, was waiting quietly in a drawer sealed in ink and dates and numbers. And when the time came to open that envelope, I wanted it to happen here at this table with tea cooling between us. Vanessa didn't step fully inside at first. She stood just beyond the threshold, one hand still gripping her purse strap, eyes moving quickly through the entryway, as if she expected someone to jump out and explain this away. When she finally crossed into the house, it was with the stiff posture of someone entering unfamiliar territory they don't trust. "This is bigger than I thought," she said. "It's comfortable," I replied. She walked past me without responding, heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She stopped in the living room, turned slowly, then walked to the window and stared out at the yard. For a moment, she forgot to perform. "I didn't know you could afford this," she said, not unkindly this time, just honestly. "I can," I said. She turned to face me. "Since when?" I met her eyes. Since I stopped explaining myself. That landed. I could tell because she blinked and looked away the smallest crack in her composure. I gestured toward the kitchen table. "Tea." She hesitated, then nodded. We sat across from each other, the table between us like a neutral zone neither of us had agreed on, but both understood. Vanessa lifted her cup, took a sip, then set it down again. Her fingers lingered on the handle, tapping once, twice. "You should have told me," she said finally. "Why?" I asked. She frowned. "Because Ava would have wanted to know. Because it's significant." "It is," I agreed. "To me." She leaned back in her chair, arms folding loosely across her chest. "I just didn't expect you to land somewhere like this." There it was again. Not surprised at my success, surprised at my capacity. I didn't correct her. Instead, I said, "Do you remember the retirement account we set up together?" Her eyes flicked to mine, then away. "Which one?" she asked too quickly. "The one we both contributed to?" I said, "before the divorce." She waved a hand dismissively. "That was years ago, Ethan. Everything was handled in the settlement." I nodded. "That's what I thought." She watched me closely now, alert. "Why are you bringing this up?" "Because," I said calmly, "I realized something didn't add up." Vanessa laughed softly. "You're overthinking it. You always did." I stood and walked to my desk. I opened the top drawer and took out the white envelope Marcus had brought weeks earlier. I didn't open it yet. I just placed it on the table between us. Her laughter stopped. "What's that?" she asked. "Records?" I said. She stared at the envelope as if it might move on its own. "Ethan, if this is about money, it's about truth." I interrupted gently. She straightened in her chair. "You're really doing this?" I didn't answer. I slid the envelope toward her and sat back down. Vanessa didn't touch it. Instead, she reached for her phone. I watched as her fingers trembled, not dramatically, but enough that she had to try twice to unlock the screen. She turned slightly away from me and dialed. "Ray," she said when the call connected. Her voice was tight now. "I need you to come here right now." She stood and paced while she spoke, glancing at the envelope as if it were a ticking device. "Yes, I'm serious. You need to see this place and bring Ava if you can." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She hung up and turned back to me, jaw set. "You're being ridiculous." "Then this will be quick," I said. We waited. The house felt different with anticipation in the air, like the quiet before a storm that never quite breaks. Vanessa paced. I stayed seated. When the doorbell rang, she jumped. Rai arrived first, Vanessa's older brother. He stepped inside, looked around, then let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, "didn't see this coming." Ava arrived a few minutes later, breathless and confused. She looked from me to her mother, then at the envelope on the table. "What's going on?" she asked. I stood. "We needed to have a seat." Vanessa protested. "This is unnecessary," but Ava sat anyway. I opened the envelope. I laid out the papers one by one, smoothing them flat. Bank statements, transaction histories, dates circled in pen. "This account," I said evenly, "was liquidated 3 months before the divorce was finalized." Vanessa shook her head. "That's not," I continued. "The funds were transferred into a checking account solely in your name." Rai leaned forward, reading. His face changed. "A week later, I went on a down payment was made on your house." The room was silent. Ava's eyes moved between the documents and her mother. "Mom?" Vanessa laughed, once sharp and brittle. "This is out of context." "Is it?" Ray asked quietly. She turned on him. "You don't understand." "I understand dates and numbers," he replied. Vanessa looked back at me, eyes flashing. "You let this go for years." "Yes," I said I did. Ava spoke again, softer now. "You told me you used your savings." Vanessa's mouth opened, closed. "I didn't say that," she insisted. "You did," Ava said. "You always did." The silence stretched. "I'm not asking for the money back," I said finally. "I don't need it." Vanessa scoffed. "Then what is this about?" I met her gaze. "It's about you not telling people I failed when you built your success on something that wasn't yours alone." She looked around the room, desperate now for allies. There were none. "I built this," I said, gesturing to the house, "without lies, without rewriting anyone else's story." I gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope. "You don't get to narrate my life anymore," I said calmly. "If you come into this house, you come as a guest, not an editor." Vanessa said nothing. Ava reached for my hand, and in that moment something settled, not just in the room, but in me, because the truth had finally spoken, and it didn't need me to raise my voice. The house felt quieter after the truth landed. Not the empty kind of quiet, the kind that echoes, but the settled kind, like dust after something heavy has been set down. Ray stood near the counter, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. Ava sat beside me at the table, her fingers wrapped around her mug, though the tea had long gone lukewarm. Vanessa remained standing, arms at her sides, her posture stiff in a way I'd never seen before. She had no script for this moment. For years, she'd moved through rooms with confidence because she believed she owned the story. She decided which details mattered, which didn't, and who was allowed to speak. Now, the paper had done what words never could. It had taken the narrative out of her hands. Ray cleared his throat. "Vanessa," he said, careful but firm, "you should have told him." She didn't look at him. She looked at me. You waited, she said, not accusing, almost bewildered. You waited all this time. Yes, I replied. Why? She asked. Why not say something sooner? I considered that for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to say it cleanly. Because I needed the truth to stand on its own, I said, and because I needed to know who I was without it. Vanessa's shoulders sagged slightly. I did what I thought was best. For who? Ava asked quietly. Vanessa turned to her, startled. For us. For you. Ava shook her head. You told everyone Dad couldn't make it on his own. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it. Ray exhaled slowly. I think we should go, he said, glancing between them. This isn't helping. Vanessa hesitated, then nodded. She picked up her purse with shaking hands, her movements suddenly unsure. At the door, she paused. I never thought you'd find out, she said. That's the part that hurt, I replied gently. Not the money, the certainty. She nodded once stiffly and left without another word. Ray followed, offering me a brief look, half apology, half respect before closing the door behind him. Ava and I stayed where we were for a long moment. I didn't know, she said finally, about any of it. I know, I replied. She stared at the tabletop, then looked up at me. I'm proud of you. The words caught me off guard, not because I hadn't earned them, but because I hadn't realized how much I'd missed hearing them. After she left, I stood alone in the kitchen and began putting things away. Cups in the sink, papers back into the envelope into the drawer beside the deed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. The fallout came quickly, but quietly. Family members stopped repeating Vanessa's version of events. Questions replaced assumptions. Some people apologized, others stayed silent. Vanessa didn't call for weeks. When she finally did, her voice was smaller. Nobody's answering me, she said. I didn't ask them not to, I replied. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted. That's honest, I said. It's a start. We didn't resolve everything in that call. We didn't need to. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with better locks. Over time, Ava came by more often. We cooked together, talked about her classes, laughed about things that had nothing to do with the past. I didn't badmouth her mother. I didn't need to. My father, who had always avoided conflict, showed up one afternoon with a toolbox. He tightened a loose railing on the deck and stayed for coffee. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Life settled into something new. Not perfect, not dramatic, just honest. Months later, standing in my living room as sunlight spilled across the floor, I thought back to that moment at the graduation party. The laughter, the label, the silence that followed. I used to think silence meant losing. Now I know better. Silence can be strategy. Truth doesn't need volume, and you don't owe anyone a confrontation, but you owe yourself the truth. If you've ever had someone rewrite your story to make themselves feel bigger, I want you to know this. You don't have to shout to take your life back. Sometimes the strongest response is a life built so solid, it speaks for itself. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you want to keep following stories about quiet strength, earned victories, and the courage to set boundaries, consider subscribing. We have many more stories like this to share, and I hope you'll be part of this journey with us. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.